The Gearhead Woodshop.
In this video, I'm going to show you how I made this shiplap accent wall using 1/4-inch plywood for less than 40 bucks. Not including the paint. Paint's expensive.
I start by making a frame for the wall. Actually, I started by making a built-in cabinet for this awkward empty space on the back wall of our family room. If you're interested in that video, I'll leave a link in the description. Anyway, I think Shiplap looks much more finished with a frame around the edges, so I cut some 1x4 to 1.5 inches wide and ripped it down to 1/2 inch thick on my table saw. Then I measured the space and cut all the pieces to length using 45-degree miters at the corners. Since the top of the frame is longer than 96 inches, I'll have to join two pieces together. Butting these against each other may leave a seam that I don't want to see, so I'm going to use something called a scarf joint. Basically, I cut these at 45 degrees and overlap them. That way I can sand them smooth and you won't see a joint when it's finished. I'd love to show you how this looks going on the wall, but I'm still a noob when it comes to making YouTube videos, and this is where I decided to put the camera for that shot. At least you can see what the finished product looks like. After I finished cutting and test fitting all the pieces, I used a 1/16 inch roundover bit on the router to smooth out all the exposed edges. I find this way to be much more consistent than just rounding it off with a sander. I use a level and a square to make sure the frame is good before securing it to the studs with 2-inch brad nails. And now I can measure for the shiplap. I take this measurement in multiple places and use the smallest number, which in this case is 53. I want to leave about a 1/16 of an inch gap between the boards. Coincidentally, a nickel is just a hair over a 1/16 and makes a perfect spacer for this job. After doing some math, I decided to cut the shiplap to 5 13/16. Add in the 1/16 inch spacer between each piece, and that should fit 9 rows perfectly without having to make a smaller piece on the top. I set my table saw fence to 5 13/16 and ripped a full sheet of 1/4-inch plywood, plus a few scraps I had lying around from other projects. Once everything was cut, I clamped them all together, gave them a quick sanding so there wouldn't be any rough edges. Then I painted the tops and bottoms, since it would be easier now than trying to squeeze the paint in the tiny gap when they're on the wall. At this point, I decided to fill all the nail holes and caulk the frame so I could put a coat of paint on that too. When it was time to paint the frame, I had some helpers with me. Whenever I'm doing demo, it usually makes me laugh when I find notes from previous contractors, so when I do a project with the kids, I like to leave something for the next guy who eventually tears out my work. In this house, there's a lot of artwork behind the walls. With that complete, it's time to start putting up the plywood. I start with an 8-foot piece over the counter, and then measure for my first couple of cuts. I decided to work my way down the wall from here first, and then work up. This row will also require me to cut out around the light switch and use a spacer to move the switch out flush with the new wall. I give myself about 1/8 of an inch extra around the spacer to make sure it's easier to get the switch in and out. I cut this out with a jigsaw, which doesn't have to be perfect since it's going to be covered by the switch plate, but this does kind of look like my 4-year-old did it. The rest of the wall measures about 16 1/4. I don't want these pieces to be super tight because I want the wood to be able to expand and not bow or crack. When I'm done, I'll use a little bit of flexible caulk on each side to make sure it looks clean and still allow for a little bit of movement. As you can see, the nickels work great as spacers for this project. I'm also going to paint the wall in between each piece because that's a lot easier to do now. I used a short piece to finish the lower section of the wall and a scrap piece to space out the trim. Since the frame pushed the baseboard out half an inch, I'm using a second piece of 1/4 inch to fill in the gap. I'm also going to have to cut a longer piece for the other side of the wall. So I removed the old one, cut a new one half an inch longer, and installed it in its place. With the trim all squared away, I can start working up the wall. I thought I would do a cool time lapse putting up the rest of the wall, or at least a good chunk of it, but this just wasn't my night. The first nail I tried to put into this board hit a drywall screw and jammed the gun. Then my kids wouldn't go to bed, and my wife, who is 9 months pregnant, wasn't feeling well. There was a lot going on. Then I miscut the next piece, and when I went to cut it again, I realized the blade on my miter saw wasn't square, which would probably explain why my boards weren't fitting quite right. So at that point, I just decided to call it a night and try again tomorrow. Except that was a lie. After I shut everything down, my mental disorders got the best of me, and I decided to go square up my miter saw and recut that last piece, so at least that part would be finished and it wouldn't keep me up all night. The next afternoon, I got back to work, cutting pieces and fitting them to the wall. I was trying to rush to get a few rows on before I had to go pick up my kids, and I ended up miscutting another piece. Rushing to get these things done always seems to make it take longer. After starting and stopping several times, I finally got this wall done. I'm just as surprised as you are, but that last row actually fit perfectly. With everything nailed into place, I went around with the wood filler and took care of all the nail holes and seams. I did the best I could to keep the dust out of the rest of the house and gave the whole thing a quick sanding. Then it was time for paint. I did 2 coats with Benjamin Moore Regal Select in an eggshell finish. The color is called Van Dusen Blue. I always start by cutting in the edges and then roll out the middle. I ended up repainting this whole wall as well. I wanted a nice crisp line at the corner, and this just made the whole thing look fresh and clean. I've used Shiplap before, but this is my first time using 1/4 inch plywood to mimic that look. Overall, I'm really happy with how this turned out. It's certainly a lot cheaper to do it this way. It might be a little more work, but I think the finished product looks just as good. Maybe even better because you can control the width of the boards. I originally spent $40 on 1 sheet of 1/4 inch plywood and an 8-foot 1x4. I did also use some scraps that I had lying around. I was going to use paint I already had, but we changed our minds on the color, so I ended up having to spend another $38 on paint. It was definitely worth it though. I think this color looks great. I'm no interior designer, but in my opinion, this accent wall looks amazing and really highlights the cabinets. To anyone thinking about doing a shiplap accent wall in their house, I would absolutely recommend doing it this way. Especially considering 1 shiplap board is almost $10, and you can get 9 of these out of one $30 sheet of 1/4 inch plywood. For a third the cost, I'm only going to do it this way from now on. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button, consider subscribing, and good luck to you on your next project.